thank you everyone for being here and welcome. Awareness and understanding of cultural responsiveness is super important. And Mary and I have been preparing this presentation for the last month. This moment in our society is really ripe for discussion and implementation of this topic. So this presentation is an introduction to a system of applying cultural responsiveness in the learning environment, specifically in course design. Mary and I are doing this presentation as a result of an online DEI officer certification program that we've been enrolled in since for the last 8 months. And so the program was created by the Council for At-Risk Students Education Practice Standards in collaboration with NERCOM, the Northeast Regional Computing. And this cultural responsive system was also developed by Dr. Courtney Platts, who is also joined us as an audience. Thank you so much, Courtney, for being here with us. She is also the chair for the Council for At-Risk Students Education Practice and Standards. So what we've been learning in this program is how to recognize academic barriers linked to marginalization, particularly in online spaces, and how to apply the cultural responsive system to decrease or remove those academic barriers. So the cultural responsive system does not replace the traditional instructional design processes and principles that we've been using, such as UDL, the Universal Design for Learning, or the Quality Matters, or OLC scorecard. But this rather enhances those processes by infusing cultural presence and cultural responsiveness. So in this presentation, we'll discuss, what culture looks like in the learning environment and in the cultural responsive system. The cultural responsive system it's a research-based system and can be applied to different areas of an institution or an organization, such as student services, leadership, or administration, basically anywhere, and also in any industry. But the focus for this presentation is on the teaching and learning environment. So let's get started. And on the next slide, the goals for this session is we'll be defining cultural responsiveness. We'll discuss what culture means in the learning environment. We'll be introduced to acculturative stress, the terminology, and what that means and looks like in the learning environment, and other terminologies in the cultural responsive system. And we'll discuss the application of the cultural responsive system standards. So heads up, focus is on the learning environment, again, not on the larger social context that we're talking about. So there will be some clinical terms referenced just to explain the topic, but you're not expected to approach cultural responsiveness from a clinician or psychologist perspective, right? And like I said, we've condensed the version of this cultural responsive system from an 8-month course that Mary and I have been taking to this 50 minutes presentation. So there are things that we will not be covering, but just slightly mention. And with that, Mary will start.
Yeah, so let's start talking about, well, what is cultural responsiveness? Next slide, please. And before we do that, let's talk about what your definition of cultural responsiveness. So for our first activity, what we'll be doing is I'm going to give you 2 minutes to type in the chat. Excuse me, I have a cough drop. I have a bit of a cough, and I don't want to start hacking and coughing in front of everybody. So I'm just letting you know that this is why I sound a little hoarse. So, okay, in the chat, put your definition of cultural responsiveness. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. When you write your definition, do not submit. Wait until I tell you to submit. This chat waterfall activity means that everybody submits at the same time. And the purpose of that is so that you're not trying to keep up with the chat and type at the same time. So so go ahead and start coming up with what your definition of cultural responsiveness is. At 1:45, we'll all hit submit together. Okay, we are at 1:45. If you have a response, please hit submit now, or just hit enter on your keyboard. If you're using your mouse, it's the little icon that looks like kind of like a paper airplane. Oh, we've got some great definitions here. So let's see, we're talking about being aware of different experiences and backgrounds, ability to understand and respond to the cultural differences of others while also self-reflecting on your own identity. Self-reflection is very important. Conveying instructions in different contexts, creating an environment that attempts to be culturally aware of influence and modify the course as needed. Understanding the difference in culture in your own community and that of others. Recognizing that all the students have different cultural backgrounds and values and using that as a tool to create inclusivity and learning for all in the classroom. These are some really, really awesome definitions and some awesome ways of thinking about cultural responsiveness. Next slide, please. So, in terms of all of your amazing responses in the chat, they're still thinking of cultural responsiveness in terms of a more theoretical sense, whereas, in this session, what we're trying to do here is to think of cultural responsiveness as more of a method, in a more as a methodology, as a way, as a prescriptive model of education practice that decreases the effects of acculturative stress. So now here's another term. What's acculturative stress? So acculturative stress, excuse me, I still have the cough drop in my mouth and I apologize, is the abrupt or enforced entry into a different and unknown cultural environment. So in thinking about how do we address acculturative stress, we're not going to be we can't try to be culturally responsive to each student in a classroom. I mean, if you have 200 students in a lecture hall or, and multiple lab sections, something like that, there's no way of addressing every single student's culture. So what you want to do is think about reflecting on how you can take cues from other cultures and then adapt that into your teaching. And this system is a way of doing that. So next slide, please. So if we look at the different areas of the 5 areas of cultural responsiveness, we're looking at culture in terms of the academic culture, the community culture, the collaborative culture, the cognitive culture, and the ethnic and intersectional culture. Notice that ethnic and intersectional is really just 1/5 of the puzzle here. It's not the entire thing. So, we usually tend to think about culture in terms of race, of ethnic culture, even gender, or a gender identity. We tend to think about it that way, but really it's a lot more than that. There's these other areas that were culture, that is part of culture, having belongingness, inclusion, equity, affirmation, and self-identity, and the academic culture. What's that culture in the academic space? As part of a community, who are the decision makers? Having your learners as stakeholders, being part of the making decisions in that culture. The collaborative culture, what are the cultural norms? What are the outcomes? How are folks in that culture socializing? And the cognitive, how are decisions made? What's the perception? What impressions are being made? So Next slide, please. So if we look at tying back to cultural responsiveness, it's the ability to integrate strategies and interventions or responses within the learning environment and improving the academic outcomes for individuals whose cultural framework might differ from the culture within the learning environment. For example, just to give a brief example, a personal one. So I'm Cuban American. My parents are from Cuba. So, even as a child, I very much had one culture at home and then one culture at school. So, so being in those two different environments, did produce a acculturative stress for me. And what cultural responsiveness does is try to mitigate that. And so we're looking here at a prescriptive method of pedagogy and andragogy, which we'll define and talk about a little bit more later, that directly teaches to that acculturative stress and focuses on decreasing that stress in the learning environment. Next slide, please. So in looking at what cultural responsiveness is and isn't and is not, cultural responsiveness is a student-centered approach. So as instructional designers, we talk a lot about backwards course design or student-centered course design. Well, this is also part of that student-centered approach. So in looking at the different attributes of ethnic cultures, so we want to try to infuse that into the assignments, the feedback, the planning, and the course design. And again, it's not about looking at every single individual student culture of each individual student in your courses. Like I said, for some courses, that's hundreds of students, and there's no way of doing that. But it's more so of taking those different attributes and bringing them together and looking at also what the curriculum is saying about the topic that you're teaching, whose voices are being centered, whose perspectives, what the influence is on cognition, what that all is. So now we know what it is. Well, what it isn't othering. It isn't treating a student differently because of their culture. It's not adopting another cultural lens that isn't yours. And it's certainly not the heroes and holidays where if we say, oh, it's Latin History Month, or, let's feature a Latin contributor. That's not it. When talking about diversifying your content, it's really more about making those contributors central to your content and really critically questioning the normative practices and the normative messages that are being sent with that curriculum. Next slide, please. So questioning those normative practices, we're looking at, since we're here in America, most of our educational practices here are very heavily Eurocentric. And we want to make sure that we're considering different concepts that may not be part of that Eurocentric focus, such as communal competence. So not just how is the class doing as a whole? How is everybody helping each other succeed? Resourcefulness, altruism, a sense of purpose, and having high expectations from any learner, for every learner, not just those of the dominant culture in that classroom. Next slide, please. So now Marta is going to take it from here and tell us why we need to have cultural responsiveness.
Okay. All right. So can you go to the next slide, please? So cultural responsiveness, why do we need it, right? We needed to, I've highlighted some of the bold items you can see there. We needed to minimize the potential for discrimination and acculturative stress. We needed to make sure that we are not led to applying all Eurocentric values that translate to oppressive perspectives. We needed to reduce threats related to stereotyping and lower expectations of students, so that by reducing or eliminating the threats, students are better able to focus on the actual learning. Next slide, please. Okay, continuing again, why we need cultural responsiveness. It is to decrease acculturative stress, which we will cover more about what that means in depth in the following few slides. But we also need cultural responsiveness to reduce depression and anxiety and isolation that could negatively affect one's practical ability to think, socialize, and construct meaning. And most importantly, we need cultural responsiveness to address what is called style divergence. So style divergence is, and if you can go to the next slide, thank you. So it's the idea that individuals differ in their thinking, and in the learning environment, they're trying to create a psychological safety while learning. And so by applying cultural responsiveness, we can create that psychological safety in the classroom for the students, so their cognitive bandwidth is open to learning instead of just fighting to be psychologically safe in that space, right? And so we need CR, cultural responsiveness, because of differences of for example, the psychological and motivational differences between what I, for example, the designer think, and the instructor versus what the students think, right? Especially when it comes to task-oriented culture, which is very dominant in classrooms. For example, like, do this, then after you do point 1, just go to point 2 and 3 and so forth, and continue this step-by-step thing. But then in style divergence, individuals have a different way of organizing sequences. So instead of going step-by-step following the task-oriented process, they may have a different way of going at it. So if we're enforcing that particular kind of task-oriented process, those individuals who think differently or who want to work from the end towards the beginning rather than from the beginning to the end, then we need to allow them that space. And that's what cultural responsive system allows us to do. So when students or learners, individuals differ in their thinking of doing tasks in a classroom environment, sometimes that behavior can be interpreted as unacceptable behavior, which then leads to more stereotyping and marginalization of the learner, which then leads to that learner having this acculturative stress, which then leads to that student's cognitive space being taken up by just trying to stay psychologically safe and not expanded to learning, right? And so when cultural responsiveness is applied appropriately, it can reduce the impact of style divergence and then reduce the acculturative stress in the learning environment. Okay, and so now Mary will be taking us through what acculturative stress means.
Okay, perfect. Just in time. I've got a new cough drop. Okay, so what is acculturative stress? So let's go back to that. So it's this forced entry into a different and unknown cultural environment. It's a different culture than what you're used to. And it causes a reduction in health status. So this could be psychological, it could be somatic, it could be, different social aspects. If of the individuals who are undergoing this acculturation. It's experienced as personal destabilization or from the usual cultural context. Using myself as an example, since I'm an expert on me. We look at, in terms of, say, having to go to school in a different culture than the culture I was living in at home. It's trying to understand what those unspoken social rules are. Like, that's one of the things that that happens, where there's like this, there's a lot of unknowns, and you're there trying to figure out what these unspoken rules are. So that was a lot of my experience growing up. This can cause, and trying to figure all of this out now creates barriers to learning. And since you're spending so much time trying to figure out what everybody else seems to know, now there's a diminished cognitive bandwidth. So now you don't have your full energy to be focused on your learning. And what cultural responsiveness does is reduce the impact of that acculturative stress. Next slide, please. So we all have different ways in which we respond to acculturative stress. So some of us listen to music, some of us binge watch Netflix shows or go for a walk, or some of us just also internalize everything, and while they're trying to figure out how to navigate these environments. Next slide, please. So the first one is assimilation. Basically, this means that you're a complete and full adoption and absorption of the culture. If you feel comfortable in this new environment, you can function well. But this only happens for some folks. Other folks don't do so well with assimilation. It's not something they can do all the time. For some people, they're going to be masking, and they're great at pretending, but it might, they might still have that destabilization happening internally. Next slide. Another way folks deal with assimilation, with acculturative stress is through integration, where they maintain one's own culture and accept and adopt the host culture, and somewhat accept the learning environment while retaining one's cultural identity. But there might still be a few barriers there. One example, is trying to balance going to school remotely when the preference might be face to face. So technology might be an example of integration. Getting students the help they needed, because remember, technology can be part of that academic culture. We're not just talking about culture here in the ethnic or racial sense. But they might be okay for the most part, but there's still that difficulty in getting up and running and all of that. And we saw a lot of that when everybody went remote due to COVID. Next slide, please. Separation. And this happens when the person experiencing acculturative stress is alienated, and separates themselves from the majority culture, from the majority society, and prefers to socialize in their own culture. And in this case, this is where cultural responsiveness is definitely needed. This person's having trouble norming in this shift from one culture to another, and their participation's decreasing. So they need help they need help in terms of learning in that different culture in the learning environment. And one of the downsides of this is when the student starts to separate, they might be seen as lazy. They might be seen as less than. And of course, this is also going to cause them to separate even more. Next slide, please. And then we have marginalization. So, becoming alienated from one's own culture and the host culture. And this now is going into the extreme case where the student might not be participating in the course at all and now dropping the course. And their cognitive bandwidth is basically just trying to just survive. And and now the cognitive bandwidth is just not there for learning. And basically trying to protect themselves. So while it might look like they don't want to learn or they can't learn, that's not necessarily the case. Trying to survive in these social environments, now the students trying to self-protect. So in looking, there's there might be a social marginalization and an individual marginalization where the student is it's not that they're it's not their fault, even though it might seem to look that way, but they really have separated themselves from everything. Next slide, please. So now in thank you, Courtney, for your comment. Yes, these examples are the psychological examples of how people respond to a culture of stress, not the social aspects, such as we expect students to assimilate into the larger culture. Right. So this is how people respond. This isn't what we expect students to do. We shouldn't expect students to assimilate into the larger culture. So let's try a poll activity. Let's hope this works, given the different tech problems today. So, okay, I just published the poll. Does everybody see it? On the right side of your screen, there's the chat, and right next to it, there's the session poll. If you can respond to that, how do you think most of your students cope with acculturative stress? Okay, so I'm showing the results. Once you, I see that most of your students are integrating. A couple of people said separation and marginalization. Okay, and a few said assimilation. Okay. Okay, I mean, I don't know that there's a way we could fully know that, depending on how well you know your students, but even just the 2 votes for separation and marginalization, that still makes cultural responsiveness fully worthwhile. We want to make sure that every student feels included and every student is not facing challenges to their learning. Okay, next slide, please. And Marta will pick up on the cultural presence model.
Okay, so the cultural responsive system, there are 3 culture frameworks to choose from. So we won't cover all of them in this presentation because there's a lot to do. But in general, like in short, the 3 cultural frameworks are: one is the cultural lens approach by Harden et al. And we have a link for that in the appendix section you can explore later. Basically, that framework says that everything is about culture. Culture frames lived experiences. So the second culture framework is this one that you're looking at on the slide here, the cultural presence model. This is developed by Dr. Courtney Platts. And what this model tells us, is that it is enhancing the community of inquiry theory model, which is, it has like the three interdependent elements of social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence. This cultural presence model adds to those three the cultural presence, right? So I have highlighted intentional here because applying cultural responsiveness is not an intuitive process. It needs a lot of practice and a lot of like going out of your way to really intentionally find things and be applying it. Anything that's like historically removed from the teaching and learning process, just being aware of that and incorporating that into your teaching practices. So, okay, so if we go to the next slide. The cultural presence model has 5 components. Intentionality, as I mentioned earlier, is the most important to think about to do this intentionally. And transactional versus relational, it emphasizes more of a relational relationship building aspect. And it focuses on communal cultures, collaborative and contextual learning. It emphasizes interdependence versus independence. So independence and individualism is Eurocentric in nature. That is not a bad thing, but we don't need in the learning environment incorporate an interdependence as well. And then convergent versus divergent thinking, allowing divergence thinking to flow in the classroom, in the way you're teaching, in the activities that you're sharing, you're developing for your students. All right, next slide. So the third cultural framework is the cultural responsive taxonomy. So I have these, the Bloom's taxonomy and the cultural responsive taxonomy side by side as a comparison. We're using mostly the Bloom's cognitive process dimension. This is the taxonomy. That's still relevant, although it was in 1956 it was developed, it's still relevant today, right? So in this cultural responsive system, we're saying, okay, let's add these components as well. What are we doing to form norming? How are we cultivating? Can the learner cultivate relationships of academic support, and what are we doing there? Can the learner make meaning of the content, reflecting what are we doing to promote that? Can the learner carefully examine the actual content via experience, and what are we doing what are we doing to promote that in our classes? And then can the student actively apply content action? And then how are we doing that in the classrooms? All right, so next slide. Okay, so this, Mary covered this area earlier. This is basically, we call them the 5 areas of cultural responsiveness. These are the areas that if you were to apply cultural responsiveness, these are the areas of effectiveness. You would identify and choose where you would apply the cultural responsiveness practices. And this would make sense once you start working on it. But right now, I know it's going to sound very confusing. And again, we're just introducing the terminology here. We're not expecting you all to understand all of what we're talking about today. All right, so the next slide.
So, oh, nope, go back to the one before that. Cool. Okay, because I did want to point to these images. So when we talk about learning, when we talk about teaching, we talk about pedagogy all the time. And we use this, I think we use this term pedagogy without really thinking about what it means. So there's another term, andragogy, which is more so more so, I don't want to say it's pedagogy for adults, but you might, it kind of leads there. So when we look at pedagogy, you see the little brain, and I found this image on Adobe stock photos, and I thought it was perfect, where we're dumping this knowledge. Students are vessels waiting to be filled with knowledge. They're sitting in a classroom and they're just waiting to learn. Where in andragogy, we're taking these students' experiences and cultures, and we're creating this learning where we're all learning together, where we're putting all the puzzle pieces together, where there's contributions from the student as well. And it's not thinking about it in terms of vessels waiting to be filled. In andragogy, since it really it's more describing theoretical applications of learning with adults, we're expecting them to bring their experiences into the classroom. And unfortunately, thinking about learning in terms of pedagogy, in terms of students waiting to be filled, does create an unsafe environment, because now it narrows the focus and the application of cultural responsiveness. Number one, it's very Eurocentric focused, and also it sets up this power dynamic where, and we use this phrase all the time in instructional design, where the instructor is the sage on the stage, imparting knowledge, versus, the guide on the side to, in learning, and we're all learning together and we're creating knowledge together in the classroom. Next slide, please. So if we look at andragogy and we look at pedagogy and the different domains of what that looks like, in terms of content, the content and the subject matter remains the focus of the education practice. Whereas with andragogy, we're looking more at the student's desire and their self-motivation, and use their ways of learning to really co-create that knowledge in that classroom. And I don't think we've mentioned this earlier. When we say classroom or learning environment, we're talking physical face-to-face. We're talking, oh boy, we have 3 more minutes. So we're talking face-to-face. We're talking online, asynchronous online, all the modalities. So this, when I say classroom, I'm not just speaking of a physical classroom. So, okay. In the learner domain, the learner is expected to complete task-oriented activities, whereas with andragogy, there's an importance in the social roles and the collaborative settings, and then there's opportunities for learning there. The role of the instructor, as I mentioned before, with pedagogy, students are highly dependent on directions and instructions and peers, where with andragogy, there's more of a focus on using problem-solving skills, and the facilitator, the instructor is more of a facilitator, not a director. And then in the learning domain, learning is subject-centered and tied directly to content, whereas with andragogy, there's a range of applications for learning and knowledge acquisition. Okay, so next slide. And this is when we put all these different sections. We talked about the 5 areas of culture. We talked about the different cultural frameworks. And then are the 13 standards in which cultural responsiveness can be used to apply cultural responsiveness. So Marta is going to go now into this a little bit more, but this is just a brief, just showing what the whole system looks like. Next slide.
The CRS system has 13 standards. You will see them here, and they're also listed in the Appendix A section in depth. So when you get the slide, you can look at that yourself later on. But just quickly on how to apply this. So if we pick the next slide, please. So standard 6 talks about sense of community, how you create sense of community and how it's important in your class, right? So taking this example, next slide, please. What we can do is come up with like a sense of community rubric. This is a sample. So we've come up with this, and then let's take this now. And if we go to the next slide, this is the whole total of the culture responsive system. And if we go to the next slide, please. Then this is how the sense of community rubric example fits in the CRS. So you have the culture framework that we picked. It's the CP model, which is the culture presence model, and it's all about collaboration and contextual learning. And the areas of effectiveness, areas of culture that this sense of community supports are the academic belongingness and the community culture. Learners are stakeholders, decision makers, and caretakers. And then the standards that this sense of community rubric applies to are the sense of community standard and the classroom management standard, which are in the Appendix A section. I'm talking too fast now. And then standards 11 and 13 are always constant in all of your application of the cultural responsive system. So here we have tier 1, I put, and tiers are things that we don't go into, but basically it's the level of, it measures the level of cultural responsiveness that you would apply to your class. Tier 1 means whatever you're applying is to the whole class. Tier 2 is for groups, and tier 3 are more like for individuals and differentiated instruction. So we're not covering 2 and 3, but just for 1, this sense of community rubric again applies to everybody. The CP model, sense of community classroom management, and then the academic and community area of effectiveness. So, and then if we go to the next slide, and the next slide will go to, and this will be, the standards will just continue like this. So if you're at Rutgers and you want to follow up more about this, you can reach out to us, Mary and I, and we can go a little more in depth with this. And if you are not with Rutgers, I mean, you can still contact us. And then in the resources section, if you go all the way to the resources, Amina, there are places you can explore on your own. But we're hoping this will, you know, as we become more and more practice this more, we're hoping to expand this a lot more than just the Rutgers community. Hopefully within the Rutgers community, start there. And I know Dr. Courtney Platts is doing this all over the country. So I don't know, Courtney, do you want to say something, add anything to this?
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I just wanted to jump in real quick. So the one of the, just a couple of overview principles. Acculturative stress in the research is a byproduct of racism and stereotyping, and the stress that goes along with just living your life as a BIPOC person in the United States. And so Martha and Mary did a great job of, like, you know, just kind of giving the overview. And I know Wanda had asked, and I think Mary and Marta, can you just send an example to Wanda about a culturally responsive lecture launch? That's one of the easiest things that you can do in your course. At its core, you ask your students for pictures that represent themselves or their culture or their family, and you add them into a PowerPoint, and you ask a question like this: if you could talk to an ancestor from 150 years ago, what would you want them to know about your learning experience? Or what would you want to learn from them? And so it's just a really easy way to add representation, and it's a really easy way to just start off the cultural conversation. And for students who need and want to have that discussion, it's there. And for students who need to develop cultural competency, it also becomes a resource for them to learn about people they might not otherwise learn about. But you know, definitely reach out to Marta and Mary and myself if you know, if there's anything I can do to help or support. So great job today, ladies. Thanks, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Courtney, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Yep. Thank you so much, Courtney.
Thank you for your input. Thank you so much. And thank you for the whole class that we've been taking this for the last 8 months.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah.
And for this whole system.
Okay, I think everybody can see the slide now.
Yeah.
Woo, okay, we got it.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Marta and Mary. Thank you so much. This was informative. This was excellent. There was so much stuff packed into this presentation.
Yeah.
And thank you for sharing the slides, because the things that we weren't able to go into a lot of detail for, we all have the material now. And hopefully with your contact information, people can reach out to you if they want some more details and if they would like you to elaborate on anything. Thank you, everybody. And let's move on to the next session now.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you,
Take
everyone.
care. Yeah.
Thank you. Take care.